October 31st, 1937, Halloween night. The air over Rosedale, Mississippi hung thick and heavy, like a wet blanket draped across the delta. The First Baptist Church stood at the eastern edge of town, a simple white clapboard structure with a steeple that pointed toward heaven like an accusing finger. The building was 50 years old that year, built in 1887 by freed slaves who pooled their meager resources to create a place of worship, a sanctuary from the cruelties of the world outside. The church sat on a slight rise, surrounded by a graveyard where headstones leaned at odd angles, some so weathered that the names carved into them had become illegible, lost to time and rain and the relentless Mississippi sun. Inside, the church was empty that night, or it should have been. Church services happened on Sundays, on Wednesday evenings for prayer meetings, and occasionally for funerals or weddings. But never at midnight, never on Halloween. The building should have been dark, locked, silent. But at exactly midnight on October 31st, 1937, 40 people sat in those wooden pews and watched something that would destroy their faith, shatter their understanding of reality, and haunt them for every remaining day of their lives. They watched Robert Johnson, the bluesman whose name was already becoming legend throughout the Delta, walk through those church doors, carrying his worn Gibson guitar. They watched him sit in the front pew, as if he belonged there, as if he'd been expected. And they watched him play music that shouldn't exist in this world. Music that made the walls weep, music that made the wooden benches bleed, music that opened something that had been sealed since before human beings walked upright and gave names to their gods. This isn't legend passed down through generations until the truth is buried under layers of embellishment and exaggeration. This isn't folklore twisted by time until nobody can separate fact from fiction. This is documented history, 40 witnesses, 40 people from different families, different backgrounds, different levels of education and belief, 40 individuals who saw the same impossible events unfold and spent the rest of their lives trying to convince people of what they experienced, while simultaneously wishing they could forget every single detail. What they saw in those dark hours before dawn suggests that Robert Johnson's bargain, if he made one at that crossroads people whispered about, wasn't simply about musical talent or fame, or the ability to play guitar better than any man alive. It was about something far more profound and far more dangerous. It was about opening doors between worlds. About creating bridges across the vast gulf that separates our reality from places that exist in the spaces between, in the shadows behind shadows, in dimensions our minds aren't equipped to comprehend. And once those doors are opened, once those bridges are built, they can never be fully closed again. Something always comes through, something always stays behind. Welcome to Soul Chronicles. I'm your guide through the forgotten corners of music history, the stories that get whispered in dark rooms but never written in history books, the events that witnesses spend their lives trying to explain to people who will never truly understand. For 10 months, I've been researching what happened at First Baptist Church in Rosedale on Halloween night 1937. I've traveled to Mississippi 6 times. I've walked through that church, which still stands today in a state of abandoned decay that locals say is fitting, given what it witnessed. I've tracked down descendants of the 40 witnesses, people who grew up hearing stories from parents and grandparents who were there, who saw it happen, who carried that trauma until their dying day. I've read testimony recorded by folklorists and blues historians in the 1960s and 1970s, interviews with survivors who were finally willing to talk decades after the event, their voices still shaking when they described what happened. I've examined documents from Bolivar County, death certificates and church records and property deeds that corroborate the timeline and confirm the existence of everyone involved. I've listened to audio recordings made by blues researchers, crackling tape reels, where elderly witnesses describe impossible events in matter-of-fact tones, their voices carrying the weight of absolute certainty that what they're saying is true, no matter how insane it sounds. What I discovered in those 10 months of research is more disturbing than any legend, more terrifying than any ghost story told around a campfire. Because legends can be dismissed as superstition, ghost stories can be explained away as imagination or mass hysteria or cultural mythology. But documented testimony from 40 witnesses, people from different backgrounds and beliefs, all describing the same impossible events in nearly identical terms, people whose stories never changed over decades of retelling, that's something else entirely. That's evidence of something that defies every rational explanation we have. That's proof that on Halloween night 1937, reality broke in that little white church in Rosedale, Mississippi, and it never quite healed. In this video, you're going to learn exactly what happened that night. You're going to hear the witnesses describe what they saw in their own words, transcribed from recordings and written testimonies. You're going to understand the sequence of events, the precise timeline of how an ordinary church service became a descent into supernatural horror. You're going to meet the 40 people who were there, learn their names and faces and stories. You're going to understand why none of them ever set foot in that church again, why several moved away from Rosedale entirely, why some lost their faith completely, while others clung to it with desperate intensity. And you're going to confront a question that has no comfortable answer, no easy resolution. What if music isn't just sound waves and emotion? What if certain music, played by certain people in certain places, can tear through the fabric that separates worlds? What if Robert Johnson's genius came from somewhere that predates humanity, somewhere that doesn't care about our survival or sanity or souls? Before we begin this journey into darkness, if stories like this speak to something deep inside you, if you feel drawn to these dark corners where history and horror intersect, subscribe to Soul Chronicles and turn on notifications, because every video on this channel excavates truths that were meant to stay buried, stories that challenge our understanding of what's possible and what's real. Leave a comment and tell me, do you believe a place can be marked by what happens there? Can a building absorb trauma, hold onto supernatural events, and remain fundamentally changed forever? Can wood and stone and glass remember? By the end of this story, you'll have your answer, and it might not be the answer you want. Now let's go back to Rosedale, Mississippi, October 1937, to understand how 40 God-fearing people ended up in a church at midnight on Halloween, and what they witnessed when Robert Johnson began to play music that came from somewhere beyond the edge of human comprehension. First Baptist Church of Rosedale was built in 1887, 50 years before the events of Halloween night. The construction was a community effort, former slaves and their children pooling resources, cutting timber, mixing mortar, raising walls under the brutal Mississippi sun. They built it as a fortress against the world, a place where they could gather safely, worship without fear, create community in a society that wanted to keep them scattered and powerless. The building itself was modest, nothing architecturally significant or beautiful, white clapboard exterior that required repainting every few years to keep the wood from rotting in the humid Delta climate. A simple peaked roof with wooden shingles, a small steeple with a bell that rang on Sunday mornings, calling the faithful to worship. Inside, the church was equally simple. Wooden pews arranged in rows, maybe 15 on each side of a center aisle, each pew capable of seating 6 or 7 people if they squeezed together. The pews were made of local pine, sanded smooth and treated with oil to prevent splinters. But showing their age by 1937, the wood darkened and worn from 50 years of use. A small altar at the front, nothing fancy, just a raised platform with a simple podium where the preacher stood to deliver sermons. Behind the altar hung a wooden cross, handmade, unpainted, the wood aged to a dark honey color. The walls were white-painted plaster over wooden slats. The floor was wide pine planks that creaked when you walked. 3 windows on each side, simple glass panes that let in light during day services, no electricity. The church relied on oil lamps and candles for illumination during evening services. No heat, except what came from the bodies of the congregation and a small wood stove in winter. It was a poor church serving a poor community. But it was theirs, built with their hands, maintained with their labor, filled with their prayers. The congregation in 1937 was entirely black, mostly sharecroppers who worked land they'd never own, domestic workers who cleaned white people's houses and raised white people's children for wages that barely kept them alive, and laborers who did the backbreaking work that built and maintained the Delta's infrastructure. These were people who worked 6 days a week in conditions that would break most human beings, who lived with the constant threat of violence and injustice, who survived on hope and faith and the strength of community. Sunday morning was sacred. It was the one time they could gather, could dress in their best clothes, even if those clothes were patched and mended, could sing and pray and feel for a few hours like they mattered, like they were seen and valued, if not by the world, then by God. The pastor in 1937 was Reverend Isaiah Washington, a man in his early 60s who had led the congregation for 23 years. Reverend Washington was born in 1875, just 10 years after the end of slavery, in a sharecropper's cabin not 20 miles from Rosedale. His parents were both former slaves who remembered the old times, who carried scars on their backs from whips, who knew what it meant to be owned. They raised their son with an iron determination that he would have a better life, would learn to read and write, would become something more than a field hand. Isaiah was smart, disciplined, hungry for knowledge. He learned to read using a borrowed Bible, taught himself to write by scratching letters in the dirt with a stick. At 16, he felt called to preach. He apprenticed with an older minister, studied scripture, developed a style that was passionate but controlled, emotional but grounded in careful interpretation of the Bible. By the time he was 30, Isaiah Washington was preaching regularly. At 39, he was called to lead First Baptist Church of Rosedale. He accepted, moved his wife Miriam and their 3 children to Rosedale, and dedicated himself completely to the spiritual well-being of his congregation. Reverend Washington was known as a stern man, uncompromising in his beliefs, harsh in his judgments of sin. He believed in a clear division between the sacred and the profane, between the things of God and the things of the world. There was no gray area in Reverend Washington's theology. You were on God's side or you weren't. You lived righteously or you lived in sin. Your actions either glorified God or served the devil. This black and white worldview made him an effective preacher, but not always a compassionate one. People respected him, feared him a little, but didn't necessarily like him. Church music, in Reverend Washington's view, was hymns and spirituals, songs that praised God and uplifted the soul, music that had been sanctified by generations of use in worship. Blues music, the music that was becoming increasingly popular throughout the Delta in the 1930s. The music played in juke joints and on street corners by traveling musicians. That was the devil's music. Reverend Washington preached against it regularly, dedicating entire sermons to the spiritual danger of blues. He said blues music celebrated sin, glorified drunkenness and adultery and violence. He said it kept people focused on earthly troubles instead of heavenly promises. He said it opened the door to demonic influence, that the rhythms and melodies came from dark spiritual sources. And he was particularly critical of blues musicians, seeing them as agents of moral decay, men who led others into temptation for the price of a few coins tossed into a hat. Robert Johnson had been in Rosedale several times in 1937. He played juke joints in and around town, building a reputation as one of the most talented guitarists in the Delta, maybe the most talented. People who heard Robert play came away shaken, unable to adequately describe what they'd experienced. It wasn't just technical skill, though Robert had that in abundance. It was something else, something that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and go straight into your chest, into your gut, into parts of you that you didn't have names for. His music made you feel things you didn't want to feel, remember things you'd tried to forget, confront truths you'd buried deep. It was uncomfortable and exhilarating and addictive. People who heard Robert once wanted to hear him again, needed to hear him again, even though the experience left them feeling exposed and raw. But Robert's presence in Rosedale made Reverend Washington furious. The Reverend had heard the stories that were already circulating about Robert, rumors that would become legend after Robert's death the following year, stories about a crossroads at midnight, about a tall man in a black suit who appeared when you stood at the intersection of two dirt roads and called out for help, about bargains made and prices paid, about supernatural talent granted in exchange for something precious and irretrievable. Reverend Washington believed those stories, believed them completely and literally. He didn't think they were metaphor or mythology. He thought Robert Johnson had actually made a deal with the devil, had sold his immortal soul for the ability to play guitar better than any man alive. And Reverend Washington saw Robert as a threat to his congregation's spiritual well-being, a corrupting influence that needed to be driven out. On several occasions in the months leading up to Halloween, Reverend Washington preached sermons that, while never naming Robert directly, were clearly about him. Sermons about men who sold their souls for earthly gain and lived to regret it. Sermons about music that corrupted rather than uplifted, that dragged the soul down instead of raising it toward heaven. Sermons about the devil appearing in human form to tempt the faithful, offering power and pleasure in exchange for eternal damnation. The congregation heard these sermons. Most agreed with their pastor. Blues music was worldly, dangerous, something to be avoided by anyone serious about salvation, but a few members, particularly the younger ones, were drawn to it anyway. They would sneak out on Saturday nights to stand outside juke joints, listening to the music that spilled through open doors and windows, feeling the pull of something their pastor said was evil, but that felt alive in ways church music never did. These young people felt guilty about their attraction to blues. They felt torn between the ecstasy of the music and the certainty, drilled into them by years of Sunday sermons, that listening to it was sinful. They would stand outside those juke joints, their feet moving to rhythms their bodies understood, even if their minds rejected, and they would feel like they were committing spiritual treason. Some of them confessed to Reverend Washington, hoping for guidance or absolution. The Reverend was not gentle. He told them they were flirting with damnation, that every moment they spent listening to blues music was a moment they gave to the devil, that they needed to pray for strength and turn away from temptation completely. His harshness drove some of them away from the church entirely. Others stayed but grew resentful, feeling judged and condemned for impulses they couldn't control. This tension, this spiritual conflict between sacred and profane, between the church and the blues, was running through the congregation in the weeks leading up to Halloween 1937. It created fault lines in the community, divided families, put parents against children and husbands against wives. Some people wanted the church to be more understanding, more accepting of cultural expressions that gave people joy, even if they weren't explicitly religious. Others wanted the church to be even stricter, to enforce behavioral standards more harshly, to create clear boundaries that protected the faithful from contamination by the world. Reverend Washington found himself in the middle of this conflict, trying to hold his congregation together while maintaining theological positions he believed were absolutely essential for their salvation. Then on October 28, 1937, 3 days before Halloween, something strange happened that would set in motion the events of that terrible night. Reverend Washington received a letter. It arrived in his mailbox in the late afternoon. A plain white envelope with no return address, his name written on the front in neat, careful handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, also written in that same careful hand. The message was brief, just 2 sentences. He's coming to your church on All Hallows Eve at midnight. He'll play for you and yours, and you'll understand everything. That was all. No signature, no explanation, no indication of who sent it or why. Reverend Washington showed the letter to his wife Miriam that evening. She read it twice, frowning, then looked at her husband with concern. "Who do you think sent this?" she asked. The Reverend shook his head. "I don't know, but I think I know who he is." Miriam understood immediately. Robert Johnson. The bluesman who had become an obsession for her husband, a symbol of everything he feared, was corrupting his congregation. "Why would he come to the church?" she asked. "He must know he's not welcome." Reverend Washington didn't answer. He took the letter to the church deacons that night, showed it to them, asked for their interpretation. The deacons were older men, respected leaders in the community, people whose judgment the Reverend trusted. They read the letter, passed it among themselves, discussed it in low voices. One deacon, a man named Joseph Turner, who worked as a blacksmith and had been part of the congregation for 40 years, said what others were thinking. "This feels like a challenge, like someone's testing you, testing the church, seeing if you'll stand firm or back down." Another deacon, Samuel Brooks, who farmed a small plot and had buried 3 children before they reached adulthood, said, "Or it's a prank, kids playing games. You know how they get around Halloween, trying to scare people." But a third deacon, elderly Marcus Freeman, who remembered the end of slavery and carried those memories like physical weights, said something that silenced the others. "Or it's a warning, someone trying to tell us something's coming, something we need to prepare for." The Reverend took the letter home, read it again before bed, and found he couldn't sleep. Something about the message bothered him, got under his skin in ways he couldn't articulate. The handwriting was too neat, too deliberate. The message was too specific. And the timing, 3 days before Halloween, felt intentional. The next day, October 29th, Reverend Washington did something unusual. He began to prepare. He didn't know exactly what he was preparing for, but he felt compelled to act. He gathered his most trusted church members, people he knew would stand with him no matter what happened, and he showed them the letter. He told them he believed something significant was going to happen on Halloween night, something that might require their presence and their faith. Most of the people he approached were confused. Come to the church at midnight on Halloween? Why? What purpose would that serve? But the Reverend was insistent. "If the devil is going to challenge this church," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "then the faithful need to be here to witness it and to stand against it. We will not participate in evil. We will not encourage it. But if evil manifests in this place, I want witnesses. I want people who can testify to what happened. I want the community to understand that God's power is greater than any darkness." It was strange logic, almost contradictory. The Reverend was essentially inviting people to attend what might be a display of evil, to witness something he believed was spiritually dangerous, but he framed it as a test of faith, an opportunity to prove that righteousness could withstand any challenge. And because the people trusted him, because they believed in his spiritual authority, even when they didn't fully understand his reasoning, they agreed. Over the next 2 days, word spread quietly through the congregation. Not everyone was invited. Reverend Washington was selective, choosing people he thought would stay strong, who wouldn't flee or lose their minds if something truly disturbing happened. He invited the deacons and their wives. He invited some of the older members who had demonstrated unwavering faith over decades. And perhaps most importantly, he invited some of the younger people who had been drawn to blues music, the ones who had confessed their struggles to him. He wanted them there specifically, wanted them to see what blues music really was, what it really did, what spiritual forces it really served. By October 30th, the day before Halloween, approximately 38 people had committed to being at the church at midnight. Some were excited, viewing it as an adventure, a break from routine. Others were nervous, sensing that something serious was building, even if they didn't understand what. Still others were skeptical, thinking this was an elaborate object lesson from their pastor, a staged event designed to scare them away from worldly temptations. None of them understood what was really coming. None of them could have prepared themselves for what they would witness. Halloween Day, October 31st, dawned grey and oppressive. The sky over Rosedale was low and heavy, thick clouds pressing down like a wet ceiling. The air felt wrong all day, too thick, too still, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Animals behaved strangely. Dogs barked at nothing, their hackles raised, their eyes fixed on empty space. Cows refused to be milked, shifting and stamping nervously. Chickens wouldn't leave their coops. Birds gathered in unusual numbers, covering the trees around the church in a black mass of feathers and harsh cries that sounded almost like warnings. People who lived near the church later said the temperature around the building felt different all day, colder than it should be, like the church itself was radiating chill. As evening approached and darkness fell, those who had committed to attending the midnight gathering began to feel increasing unease. Several people later testified that they almost didn't go, that something inside them was screaming to stay home, to lock their doors, to pretend they'd never heard about this midnight meeting. But they went anyway, driven by loyalty to their pastor, by curiosity, by pride that wouldn't let them back down, by something else they couldn't name. Around 11:30 that night, people began arriving at First Baptist Church. They came quietly, in small groups, moving through the darkness like shadows. The church had no electricity, so they brought oil lamps and candles, flames that flickered and danced in the still air, casting moving shadows on the walls. By 11:45, 38 people were present. They sat in the pews, speaking in whispers, their voices hushed as if they were afraid of being overheard by something that might be listening. 2 more people would arrive just before midnight, bringing the total to 40. Reverend Washington stood at the altar, his Bible open before him, his hands resting on the worn pages. His wife Miriam sat in the front pew, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face composed, but her eyes showing fear. The deacons and their families filled the first few rows. Behind them sat the younger members who had struggled with their attraction to blues music, teenagers and young adults in their 20s, sitting close together for comfort. The church was quiet except for the sound of breathing, of restless shifting, of wind outside rattling the windows. Several people would later say the temperature in the church felt wrong from the moment they arrived. Not exactly cold, but not comfortable either. The air felt thick and somehow resistant, like moving through water. Some people felt pressure in their chests, a tightness that made it hard to breathe deeply. Others felt dizzy, lightheaded, like the floor was tilting even though they could see it was level. The candles and oil lamps burned with flames that seemed too bright, too intense, throwing shadows that were too dark and moved in ways that didn't quite match the flickering light source. At 11:55, 5 minutes before midnight, Reverend Washington began to pray. His voice was strong and commanding, filling the church with words that had brought comfort for thousands of years. He prayed for protection, asking God to shield everyone present from harm. He prayed for wisdom, asking for guidance in understanding what they might witness. He prayed for strength, asking for the courage to face whatever was coming without fleeing or losing faith. He prayed for light to drive out darkness, for truth to overcome deception, for righteousness to triumph over evil. His prayer was powerful, confident, grounded in decades of faith and study. The congregation joined him, their voices rising in familiar patterns of call and response, finding comfort in ritual, in words spoken by their ancestors, in the rhythmic cadence of prayer that had sustained their people through centuries of suffering. For 5 minutes, there was nothing but prayer, nothing but the sound of faithful people calling on their God for help, for protection, for understanding. The words filled the church, layered on top of each other, creating a wall of sound that felt like armor, like defense against whatever might be coming. And then, at exactly midnight, the front door of the church opened. The sound of it cut through the prayers like a knife, sharp and final. Every voice stopped mid-sentence, every head turned toward the door, and there, standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the darkness outside, was Robert Johnson. He stood there without moving, without speaking, just looking at the assembled congregation with an expression that multiple witnesses would later struggle to describe. Not hostile or threatening, not friendly or welcoming, something else entirely. Something that suggested he was looking through them rather than at them, seeing not their physical forms, but something deeper, something essential about who they were. Robert Johnson was a small man, maybe 5'8", thin to the point of gauntness. In the doorway of that church, backlit by darkness, he looked almost unreal, like a shadow that had somehow achieved 3 dimensions. He wore a dark suit that had seen better days, the fabric shiny with age and wear, a white shirt with no tie, the collar slightly frayed, a hat pulled low over his eyes, hiding his face in shadow, and he carried his guitar, the Gibson L1 that had become famous throughout the Delta, worn smooth from constant playing, the wood glowing dully in the candlelight. Robert Johnson stood in that doorway for a long moment that felt like hours, just looking at the congregation with those hidden eyes. And then Reverend Washington found his voice. "This is a house of God," he said. And despite his earlier confidence, his voice shook slightly. "You are not welcome here. Leave now." Robert Johnson didn't respond. He didn't argue or explain or defend his presence. He simply walked forward, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor with a sound that seemed too loud, too heavy for such a small man. He walked down the center aisle, passing pews full of wide-eyed witnesses, people who shrank back as he passed, pressing themselves against the benches to avoid any contact. He walked all the way to the front and sat down in the first pew, directly across from the altar, in the seat that had been occupied by Miriam Washington just moments before. Miriam had stood quickly when Robert entered, moving aside, her hand clutching her husband's arm, her face gone pale. Robert Johnson sat down in that front pew, adjusted his guitar across his lap with casual familiarity, and looked up at Reverend Washington. For several seconds, the two men stared at each other across the small space that separated the first pew from the altar. The preacher and the bluesman, the sacred and the profane, a confrontation that felt predestined, inevitable, like two opposing forces that had been moving toward this collision since the beginning of time. "Leave," Reverend Washington said again, his voice stronger now, fueled by anger and fear in equal measure. "Leave this place now, or I will have you removed by force." Robert Johnson smiled. Multiple witnesses would remember that smile for the rest of their lives, would describe it in their testimonies years later with voices that still carried traces of the fear they felt in that moment. The smile wasn't cruel or mocking. It wasn't triumphant or gloating. It was sad, infinitely sad. The smile of someone who understood something terrible and couldn't prevent it. The smile of someone watching a story unfold that they'd seen before, that they knew the ending to, and the ending was tragic. "Reverend," Robert said, and his voice was soft, almost gentle, with a Delta accent that marked him as one of their own, someone who came from the same place, knew the same struggles. "I was invited." He didn't elaborate, didn't explain who invited him or why he was there or what he intended to do. He just sat there, his fingers moving over the guitar strings, not playing yet, just touching them, feeling their tension, getting the sense of the instrument in his hands. The Reverend opened his mouth to argue, to demand answers, to call for the deacons to physically remove this intruder, but he couldn't speak. Later, he would describe it as feeling paralyzed, like an invisible force was holding him in place. He could breathe, could think, could move his eyes, but he couldn't move his body, couldn't reach for Robert, couldn't call out. He could only watch. The congregation sat frozen as well. Several people would later testify that they tried to stand, tried to leave, but found themselves unable to move. It wasn't physical restraint, nothing they could see or touch. It was something else, a weight pressing down on them from above, a presence filling the church, holding them in their seats. One witness, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who was 23 years old that night, would later describe it this way in a recorded interview from 1968. It felt like the air turned to stone around us, like we were insects trapped in amber. We could see everything, hear everything, feel everything, but we couldn't move. We were trapped and we knew it, and there was nothing we could do except watch what happened next. Robert Johnson began to tune his guitar. The sound of it rang through the church, each string adjustment loud and clear and somehow wrong, like the notes were coming from inside people's heads instead of from the instrument. He took his time, moving from string to string with meticulous care, adjusting with a precision that seemed excessive for someone about to play in an informal setting. As he tuned, people began to notice strange things happening in the church. The candles and oil lamps that had been burning steadily began to flicker. Not from wind, all the windows and doors were closed, but flickering anyway, the flames dancing and wavering as if responding to some unseen force, some current in the air that wasn't quite air. And the shadows on the walls began to move, not in response to the flickering light, but independently, moving in ways that didn't match the light source, stretching and contracting like living things, like they had substance and will. A young man named Thomas Wright, sitting in the third row, watched as the shadow of the cross behind the altar elongated, stretched downward, reached toward the floor like a hand grasping for something. He blinked, looked away, looked back. The shadow was still doing it, still moving in ways shadows shouldn't move. He wanted to say something, to point it out to the people next to him, but his voice wouldn't work. His throat had closed. All he could do was watch and feel his heart hammering in his chest. When Robert finished tuning, he looked up at Reverend Washington one more time. The Reverend was still standing at the altar, still frozen in place, his hands gripping the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles had gone white. Robert held his gaze for a long moment, and then he said, "You wanted to see, you wanted to understand what the music is, where it comes from, what it does. So I'm going to show you. I'm going to play, and you're going to see the truth, all of it, and then you'll know. You'll know why I wish I'd never learned to play at all." The Reverend tried to speak, tried to pray, tried to call on God for intervention, but his voice wouldn't come. His throat had closed, just like Thomas Wright's, just like everyone else's. All he could do was watch as Robert Johnson's fingers found the first chord, and the moment Robert began to play, everything changed. The sound that came from that guitar wasn't like anything the witnesses had heard before, even those who had snuck out to hear Robert play in juke joints. This was different, fundamentally different. The notes didn't just fill the air, they seemed to fill reality itself, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, through the pews, through the bodies of everyone present. People felt the music in their bones, in their teeth, in their chests. It wasn't loud, not in terms of volume, but it was overwhelming, all-encompassing, like it was playing from inside their own heads. Robert played a song. Later, when witnesses tried to describe what song it was, they couldn't agree. Some said it sounded like Crossroad Blues, Robert's most famous composition. Others said it was something they'd never heard, a melody that seemed ancient and new at the same time. Still others said it wasn't any recognizable song at all, just a progression of notes and chords that shouldn't fit together but somehow did, creating harmonies that were beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The music seemed to bypass rational thought entirely, speaking directly to something primal and old, something that existed before language, before civilization, before human beings learned to stand upright and name their gods. As Robert played, his voice joined the guitar, singing words that some witnesses understood and others didn't. singing about crossroads and midnight and choices made that couldn't be unmade, singing about prices paid and debts collected and doors that opened both ways. His voice was clear and strong, filling every corner of the church, drowning out thought, drowning out fear, drowning out everything except the music. And that's when the first impossible thing happened. The woman sitting in the pew directly behind Robert, a church elder named Elizabeth Turner, who was 54 years old and had attended First Baptist Church her entire life, screamed. The sound of it cut through the music, raw and animal. People turned to look at her. She was pointing at the pew beneath her with a shaking hand, her eyes wide with horror. There, on the worn wooden seat where she had been sitting, was blood. Fresh blood, dark and wet, spreading across the wood grain in slow rivulets. It hadn't been there seconds before. There was no source, no wound, no explanation. It was just there, appearing as if the wood itself was bleeding, as if the bench had been cut and was hemorrhaging. Elizabeth scrambled out of the pew, backing away, her hand over her mouth, making small sounds of horror and disbelief. Others sitting nearby saw it too, saw the blood pooling on the wood, dripping onto the floor. And then they looked at their own pews and saw the same thing happening. Blood seeping up through the wood grain, as if the benches themselves were wounded, as if they were bleeding out. A man named James Cooper, sitting 4 rows back, watched in frozen horror as blood appeared on his pew, welling up from the wood like water from a spring. He reached out to touch it, to verify it was real, and jerked his hand back. It was warm, body temperature, fresh, real blood. Within minutes, every pew in that church was bleeding. 40 people sat paralyzed, unable to move, watching as the benches they sat on wept crimson. The blood ran down the legs of the pews, pooled on the floor, began to spread in slow rivulets toward the center aisle. The smell of it filled the church, copper and salt and something else underneath, something that smelled like earth and rot and ancient darkness. Robert Johnson kept playing. His eyes were closed now, his head tilted back, his fingers moved across the frets with impossible speed and precision, creating cascades of notes that seemed to come from multiple guitars, from multiple players, from sources that weren't quite physical. The guitar sang and wept and screamed, and as it did, other impossible things began to happen throughout the church. The walls started to weep as well. Not blood this time, but something else. Water, perhaps, or something like water, but thicker, more viscous, running down the white paint in slow streams like tears from unseeable eyes. The ceiling began to drip. Drops fell onto the congregation, onto their heads and shoulders. When it touched skin, it burned. Not painfully, but noticeably. A cold burn, like touching ice that's so cold it feels hot, like frostbite working its way into flesh. The windows, those simple clear glass panes that had let in daylight for 50 years, began to darken, not from the outside, but from the glass itself. The transparency faded, replaced by an opacity that was somehow worse than complete darkness because it suggested substance, suggested that something was pressing against the glass from outside, blocking the light with its mass, with its body. Several witnesses reported hearing sounds from outside the church now, scratching at the walls, something moving around the perimeter of the building with footsteps that didn't sound quite human because the rhythm was wrong, because there were too many beats, too many feet hitting the ground, and voices. Faint whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, speaking words in languages that didn't exist, languages that predated human speech, that came from throats not shaped for human sounds. A young woman named Margaret Foster, 19 years old, sitting near the middle of the church, saw something that would haunt her nightmares for the rest of her life. She saw faces in the walls. As the walls wept their strange fluid, images formed in the moisture, faces that looked almost human, but not quite. Eyes too large and too dark, like holes that went down forever. Mouths too wide, opening and closing soundlessly, showing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. Expressions of hunger and malice and something that might have been longing, might have been need. The faces appeared and disappeared, flowing into each other. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all watching the congregation with those two large eyes. Margaret tried to look away, but found she couldn't. The faces held her gaze, and she would swear on her life and her soul in testimony recorded 50 years later, that one of the faces smiled at her, smiled and mouthed her name, knew her. The temperature in the church began to fluctuate wildly. One moment the air was stifling hot, so hot that people gasped for breath, felt sweat pour down their faces despite the terror that should have made them cold. The next moment it was freezing, so cold that their breath came out in visible clouds and frost formed on the blood-slicked pews. Hot, then cold, then hot again, cycling faster and faster until people couldn't tell anymore, until their bodies didn't know how to respond, until they were shaking and sweating simultaneously. And through it all, Robert Johnson played, never stopping, never even pausing. The music was constant, relentless, building in complexity and intensity. Layers upon layers of sound that shouldn't be possible from one guitar and one voice. Reverend Washington, still standing frozen at the altar, finally found his voice. He began to pray, shouting prayers, calling on God, demanding divine intervention. His wife Miriam joined him, her voice rising in a hymn, one of the old spirituals that had sustained their people through slavery and its aftermath. Several others in the congregation tried to join, tried to sing, tried to drown out Robert's music with sacred songs, but their voices were thin, weak, barely audible. The guitar swallowed them effortlessly. The blues overpowered the hymns as if they were whispers against a hurricane. It was like trying to shout down a storm. The reverend's prayers grew more desperate, more frightened. He called on Jesus, on angels, on every saint he could name. But nothing changed, nothing stopped. The church continued its impossible bleeding. The walls continued their weeping. The faces in the moisture continued their watching. Then something happened that broke several people completely, that shattered whatever fragile grip on sanity they still maintained. The cross behind the altar, the simple wooden cross that had hung there for 50 years through countless services and weddings and funerals, began to move, not falling from its nail, moving deliberately. Rotating slowly, turning on its mounting point with a precision that couldn't be accidental, that suggested intention, that suggested something was turning it. People watched in absolute horror as the cross rotated, degree by degree, until it hung completely upside down. An inverted cross, the ultimate symbol of desecration, of mockery, of everything sacred turned profane. People screamed. Some tried again to stand, to run, to escape, but still couldn't move, still couldn't escape. They were held in place by whatever force had filled the church, by whatever presence Robert's music had summoned or awakened or given form to. They could only watch as the cross completed its rotation and hung there, inverted, wrong. Reverend Washington fell to his knees. His hands covered his face. He was weeping, his shoulders shaking, his faith shattering in real time as everything he believed about God's power and protection crumbled. His wife Miriam tried to reach him, but she too was frozen, unable to leave her pew, unable to offer comfort. A young man named Thomas Wright, sitting in the back row, would later say this was the moment he understood they were all going to die. That Robert Johnson wasn't just playing music, he was performing a ritual, opening a doorway, summoning something. And once that doorway was fully open, once whatever was on the other side came through completely, it would consume them all. Every single person in that church would be destroyed, their bodies broken, their souls taken to wherever Robert's music connected to. Thomas closed his eyes and prayed not to be saved, because he didn't believe salvation was possible anymore, but for it to be quick, for the end to be merciful, for death to take him before he saw what was coming through that doorway. Robert Johnson played for 37 minutes total. Multiple witnesses who had watches confirmed this exact timing in later testimonies. 37 minutes of impossible music in a church that bled and wept and twisted reality around itself. 37 minutes that felt like hours, like days, like an eternity compressed into mortal time. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Robert's hands lifted from the strings. The last note hung in the air, fading slowly, reluctantly, like it didn't want to die. The moment the sound disappeared completely, everything else stopped too. The blood stopped flowing from the pews. The walls stopped weeping. The temperature stabilized at something close to normal. The pressure that had held everyone in place released all at once, and people gasped as if they'd been holding their breath for the entire performance. Robert Johnson stood. He looked around the church slowly, his gaze moving across the faces of the congregation, seeing their terror, their trauma, their broken faith. His expression was sad, profoundly sad, like he'd just carried a heavy burden for a long distance and was relieved to put it down, but grieving what that burden had cost. "You wanted to see," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow audible to everyone in that silent church. "You wanted to know if the music was from the devil. Now you know the truth. It's not from the devil. The devil's just a story you tell yourselves to make sense of evil. This music comes from somewhere the devil won't go, somewhere older than your God or his adversary. Somewhere that was here before the first human drew breath and gave names to the forces they couldn't understand." He paused, looked at Reverend Washington, still on his knees at the altar. "The music opens the door to that place. And what comes through when the door is open?" He trailed off, shook his head. "I'm sorry you had to see it. But you asked. You insisted. You thought your faith would protect you, that your prayers would keep you safe. But there are things in this universe that don't care about faith or prayers or the borders you draw between sacred and profane. They just are, and the music lets them in." Robert Johnson walked back up the center aisle, his footsteps leaving bloody prints on the floor from where he'd walked through the puddles of blood that had dripped from the pews. When he reached the door, he paused and looked back one final time. "The church will remember," he said. "Buildings hold memories, especially when something like this happens. This place will never be clean again. You'll feel it every time you try to worship here. You'll know something's wrong, something's been marked, something's been changed. And you'll be right, because a door was opened here tonight, and doors once opened never fully close again. Something always stays behind." And then Robert Johnson walked out into the Halloween night. The door closed behind him, and the spell, or whatever it had been, fully broke. People erupted into chaos. Some ran for the door immediately, fleeing into the darkness without looking back, running blindly through the night, desperate to get away from that cursed building. Others sat stunned, unable to process what they'd experienced, their minds simply shutting down in self-protection. Still others wept, their sobs filling the church, raw sounds of trauma and loss and broken belief. Reverend Washington remained on his knees at the altar, staring at the inverted cross, tears streaming down his face. His wife Miriam finally found she could move, and she went to him, helped him stand, led him toward the door on unsteady legs. As people filed out of the church in small groups, moving slowly like survivors of a catastrophe, they looked around at what had happened, at the physical evidence of the impossible night. The blood was still there, drying now, darkening, but unmistakably present. The pews were stained deep crimson, the wood saturated. The floor was slick with it, puddles and rivulets that caught what little light remained from the guttering candles. The walls still showed moisture tracks, though the fluid itself was evaporating, leaving behind stains that looked like scorch marks, like the walls had been burned from the inside, and the cross remained upside down, hanging inverted as a permanent marker of what had happened. By 1 in the morning, everyone had left. The church stood empty, its interior transformed from a place of worship into something that looked like the site of violence, of violation, of desecration. The next morning, Reverend Washington returned with several of the deacons. They brought buckets and brushes and cleaning supplies. They were going to restore the church, make it right again, scrub away the evidence of Halloween night, and reclaim their sanctuary. They worked for hours, scrubbing the pews, the floors, the walls, but the stains wouldn't come out. The blood had soaked too deep into the wood grain, become part of the material itself. They tried harsher chemicals, lye and bleach and industrial solvents. The stains faded slightly but never disappeared. They tried painting over the wall stains, applying coat after coat of fresh white paint. But the marks showed through every layer, darker streaks that wouldn't be hidden. They tried to right the cross, to return it to its proper position, but when they lifted it down from the wall, they discovered the nail hole had somehow expanded. The wood around it warped and split. They tried to rehang it in its original position, but it wouldn't stay. Within hours, it would fall off the wall, clattering to the floor. They tried moving it to a different position. Same result. They tried using stronger nails, different mounting techniques, heavy wire. Nothing worked. The cross would not stay on the wall in its upright position. They could hang it inverted and it would stay perfectly secure. But right side up, it fell every time. Finally, exhausted and defeated, they gave up. They left the cross lying on the floor behind the altar, unable to display it, but unwilling to destroy it or throw it away. First Baptist Church of Rosedale held one more service. The Sunday following Halloween, November 7th, 1937, Reverend Washington stood before a congregation that was missing more than half its usual attendees. The 40 people who had been in the church that Halloween night were not there. Most would never return. And many who hadn't been there still stayed away, sensing something was wrong, feeling the change in the building, even without knowing what had caused it. The church felt wrong. Cold despite the mild November weather, dark despite sunlight streaming through the windows, heavy with a presence that pressed down on everyone inside, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to pray. Reverend Washington tried to preach. He stood at the altar, opened his Bible to a familiar passage, and tried to deliver a sermon about faith, enduring through trials. But the words wouldn't come. He stood there for nearly 5 minutes in silence, his mouth opening and closing, his hands shaking as they gripped the podium. Finally, he closed the Bible, looked at the sparse congregation and said, "I have nothing to say. I have no wisdom to offer. I don't understand what happened here. I don't know what it means. And I don't know if I believe anymore that faith is enough." It was a shocking confession from a man who had preached unwavering certainty for decades. People sat stunned. And then, quietly, they began to leave. Within 15 minutes, the church was empty, except for Reverend Washington and his wife. The church officially closed 3 weeks later, on November 28, 1937. The congregation voted to merge with Second Baptist Church in a neighboring community. The building in Rosedale was abandoned. For years, it sat empty. No one wanted to buy it. No one wanted to develop the property. It was just left there to slowly fall into disrepair, a monument to something that shouldn't have happened but did. The bloodstains on the pews faded over time, but never disappeared completely. Even today, more than 80 years later, if you know where to look, you can still see them. Dark marks in the wood grain that suggest the shape of something that flowed and pooled. The wall stains are still visible too, darker streaks that run down the white paint like old tears, like scorch marks that won't heal. The 40 witnesses to what happened that Halloween night were forever changed. Some moved away from Rosedale entirely, unable to stay in a town that held that terrible memory. Others stayed, but withdrew from public life, became reclusive, stopped attending church or social gatherings. A few lost their minds entirely, were institutionalized. spent their remaining years in facilities where they muttered about bleeding churches and inverted crosses and music that came from places humans weren't meant to know about. The rest carried the trauma silently, locked it away deep inside, and tried to live normal lives despite the weight of what they'd seen. When blues researchers in the 1960s and 1970s started seriously investigating Robert Johnson's life and legacy, interviewing people who had known him or seen him perform, a few of the Halloween night witnesses were willing to talk. Their testimonies, recorded on tape or transcribed in notebooks, are remarkably consistent. All describe the blood appearing on the pews. All describe the walls weeping and the temperature fluctuations and the cross inverting itself. All describe the sense of something pressing in on them, holding them in place, something vast and ancient and utterly indifferent to human life or suffering. And all describe Robert Johnson's music as the most beautiful and most terrible thing they ever heard, something that bypassed their ears entirely and spoke directly to parts of them they didn't have names for. Sarah Mitchell, interviewed in 1968 at age 54, said, "People ask if I still believe in God after what happened. I tell them I don't know, I want to believe. But that night showed me there are forces in this world that exist outside everything the Bible talks about. Things older than Christianity, older than any religion, and music, real music like Robert played, connects to those forces, opens doors to where they live. I spent 30 years trying to convince myself it was mass hysteria or hallucination, but I can't. It was real. The blood was real. The terror was real. And whatever came through that doorway when Robert played, that was real too." James Cooper, interviewed in 1972 at age 61, said, "That wasn't the devil. Everyone wants to say the devil, make it fit into their religious framework. But it wasn't him. It was something that makes the devil look like a children's story, something that doesn't care about souls or morality or any of the things we build our lives around. It just exists." And Robert made contact with it somehow, maybe at a crossroads, maybe somewhere else, but he opened a channel to it, and that night in the church, he showed us what was on the other end of that channel. He was warning us, I think. Warning us not to seek what he found, because the music was incredible, transcendent, the most perfect artistic expression I've ever witnessed. But the cost was everything, everything. Margaret Foster, the young woman who saw faces in the walls, never gave an interview. She moved to Chicago in 1939 and rarely spoke about her time in Mississippi. But her daughter, interviewed in 1985, said her mother had nightmares for the rest of her life. Would wake up screaming about eyes in the walls, about mouths that smiled and knew her name. On her deathbed in 2003, Margaret's last coherent words were, "Tell them it was real. Tell them we weren't crazy. Tell them Robert Johnson opened something that night and it's still open, still watching, still waiting." Reverend Isaiah Washington left the ministry in early 1938, just 2 months after Halloween. He lived quietly until his death in 1951 at age 76. His wife Miriam, who outlived him by 12 years, said he never set foot in a church again after that night. Couldn't bring himself to do it. His faith, which had been the foundation of his entire adult life, had been built on certainty, on the belief that God was more powerful than any evil, that prayer could protect the faithful, that righteousness would triumph. But Halloween night showed him something his theology couldn't explain or contain, showed him forces that existed outside the Christian framework entirely, and it shattered something in him that never healed. Several of the younger witnesses, the ones who had been attracted to blues music despite their pastor's warnings, gave up music entirely after that night. Couldn't listen to it anymore. Couldn't even hear a guitar without feeling physically sick, without remembering the impossible sounds that came from Robert's instrument, without feeling the presence that music summoned, pressing down on them again. A young man named David Hughes, who had been teaching himself guitar and dreaming of becoming a musician, destroyed his instrument the day after Halloween. He took it out into a field, raised it over his head, and smashed it against a tree until it was nothing but splinters and broken strings. When friends asked why, he said, "Because I understand now what an instrument can become, what it can open, what it can let through. And I don't want any part of that. I don't care how beautiful the music is. The price is too high." Thomas Wright, the young man who believed they were all going to die that night, did die young. Less than a year later, in September 1938, at age 24, he stepped in front of a train. Witnesses said it wasn't an accident, that he looked directly at the approaching locomotive and walked onto the tracks deliberately. He left no note, no explanation. But people who knew him said he'd never been right after Halloween, that something in him had broken, that he couldn't sleep or eat properly, that he jumped at shadows and heard music where there was none. His family believed the horror of that night had driven him to suicide, that he couldn't live with what he'd seen and what it meant. The building that housed First Baptist Church of Rosedale still stands today, though it's in severe disrepair. The roof has partially collapsed, exposing the interior to weather. The windows are broken, just jagged shards of glass in empty frames. The door hangs crooked on broken hinges. Nature is slowly reclaiming the structure, vines growing up the walls, small trees forcing their way through cracks in the foundation. The area around it has been developed over the decades. Houses, businesses, a small strip mall. But that lot where the church sits remains empty except for the ruined building. No one will buy the property. No one will develop it. There's been talk over the years of tearing the building down, clearing the lot, making it usable. But nothing ever comes of it. The building remains, slowly collapsing in on itself. A monument to something that happened there 83 years ago. I visited that church 3 times during my research for this video. The first time was in the daytime, approaching it in full sunlight with other people present. Even then, even with every rational assurance of safety, I felt reluctant to enter. The building radiated wrongness, a sense of something fundamentally out of place, like a wound that never healed properly. The air around it felt different, thicker, harder to breathe. I forced myself to walk through the broken doorway into the dim interior, and immediately I understood why no one would buy this property, why the building has been left to rot. Inside, even now, the church feels wrong. The temperature is noticeably colder than outside, even in the middle of summer, when the delta heat makes everywhere else unbearable. The air has a quality to it, a thickness, an almost liquid resistance. And there's a smell, faint but unmistakable, copper and earth and rot. The bloodstains on the pews are still visible if you know where to look, faded to dark brown, but definitely there, marking the wood. The walls still show the streaks, darker lines running down the paint like old tears or scorch marks that won't heal. The cross that inverted itself, that Halloween night is long gone, either removed or rotted away. But the space where the altar stood still feels different from the rest of the church. Heavier, darker, wrong. I brought recording equipment on my second visit, professional audio gear, cameras, temperature sensors. I wanted to document the space, see if I could capture any evidence of the presence people described. The equipment malfunctioned almost immediately. Batteries that were fully charged when I entered the building died within 5 minutes. Digital recorders shut off randomly, refusing to stay powered on for more than a few seconds at a time. The temperature sensors gave impossible readings, fluctuating wildly between extreme heat and extreme cold, with no pattern or explanation. When I finally managed to capture a few minutes of audio, it was full of interference, static and strange sounds underneath. Whispers maybe, or music, or something else I couldn't identify. I sent the audio to a sound engineer friend for analysis. He called me back 3 days later and said, "I don't know what you recorded, but it's not normal environmental noise. There are patterns in the interference, like words or music, but in frequencies that shouldn't be there. It's disturbing. Delete it." On my third visit, I went alone at night. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to recreate some element of what the 40 witnesses experienced. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it was just a building, that the stories were exaggerations, that the sense of wrongness was psychological rather than real. I arrived around 11 at night, parked on the street, and walked to the church with only a flashlight. The building looked even worse in darkness, like a corpse propped up and pretending to be alive. I stood outside for several minutes, gathering courage before forcing myself to enter. Inside, in the dark, the church was terrifying. My flashlight beam seemed to be absorbed by the darkness rather than illuminating it, creating more shadows than it dispelled. The temperature was even colder than during my daytime visits, cold enough that my breath came out in visible clouds, and the sounds. Small sounds, subtle sounds that could have been settling wood or wind through broken windows or animals, but didn't sound like any of those things. Sounded like whispers, like footsteps, like music played so softly you couldn't be sure you were really hearing it. I lasted maybe 10 minutes before my nerve broke and I fled, running out of that building like something was chasing me, gasping for air, my heart pounding. I didn't look back. I got in my car and drove away and swore I'd never enter that building again. Because the witnesses were right, the building does remember. The door Robert Johnson opened that Halloween night didn't close when he stopped playing. It stayed open just a crack, just enough for something to remain present, to press against the membrane between worlds, to make itself known through cold air and strange sounds and the persistent sense that you're being watched by something that doesn't wish you well. The church is a wound in reality, a place where the fabric that separates our world from somewhere else was torn and never properly mended. The 40 witnesses are all dead now. The last survivor, Margaret Foster's friend Elizabeth Turner, passed away in 2008 at the age of 94. Before she died, she gave one final interview to a folklore researcher from the University of Mississippi who was studying Robert Johnson. The researcher asked if she thought Robert Johnson was evil, if he was deliberately trying to traumatize people or prove something. Elizabeth was quiet for a long time, her elderly hands trembling slightly as she considered the question. Finally, she said, "No, Robert wasn't evil. Robert was desperate and talented and foolish, like a lot of young men are. He wanted to be great so badly that he made a bargain he didn't fully understand, opened a door he didn't know how to close. And that Halloween night, I think he was trying to warn us, trying to show us the cost of what he'd done, so we wouldn't make the same mistake, so we wouldn't reach for the same power he'd touched. He was showing us the truth, that genius comes from somewhere, and sometimes that somewhere is a place humans aren't meant to go. I spent 70 years terrified by what I saw that night, but I'm grateful too, because I was never tempted after that. Never wanted to reach beyond my limitations, never wanted to touch something greater than myself. I learned the lesson Robert was trying to teach us. Some doors should stay closed, some music should never be played, and some places once marked by what happens there can never be clean again. Was Robert Johnson evil? Did he make a literal deal with the devil at a crossroads? After everything I've researched, after talking to descendants of witnesses, after standing in that ruined church and feeling the weight of what happened there pressing down like a physical presence, I don't think those are the right questions. The right question is, what did Robert Johnson access? What force? What power? What ancient current of reality did his music connect to? And once that connection was made, could it ever be severed? Could the door ever be fully closed? The 40 witnesses would tell you no, would tell you that some doors, once opened, remain open forever, that some bridges once built can't be torn down, that some music doesn't just make sound, it makes doorways. First Baptist Church of Rosedale stands as a monument to that truth. A warning written in blood-stained wood and weeping walls and an inverted cross that wouldn't stay upright. A reminder that genius comes from somewhere. And sometimes the somewhere it comes from is a place we should never go. a place that doesn't care about human life or sanity or the fragile structures of meaning we build to make existence bearable. The church remembers what happened on Halloween night 1937. The building holds that memory in its bones, in its wood and stone and glass. And if you ever find yourself in Rosedale, Mississippi, if you ever drive past that abandoned church slowly collapsing at the edge of town, you'll feel it too. Feel the weight of what happened there. Feel the door that was opened and never quite closed. Feel the presence of something that came through and stayed. And you'll understand, finally, what 40 witnesses tried to tell people for the rest of their lives. Robert Johnson's music was a bridge between worlds, and bridges go both ways. Thank you for listening to this story. If it affected you, if it made you question the boundaries between reality and something else, subscribe to Soul Chronicles. Leave a comment telling me what you think happened in that church. Was it supernatural, mass hallucination, or something else entirely, something we don't have language for yet, something that exists in the spaces between what we know is real and what we know is impossible? And remember, some places are marked by what happens in them. Some buildings remember. Some wounds never heal, and some music, no matter how beautiful, comes from places we were never meant to go. Robert Johnson knew that. The 40 witnesses learned it, and the church, bleeding and weeping through a long Halloween night in 1937, proved it beyond any doubt.